everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're once again looking at the suggestions past the developers in December of 2020, and this time we're going to have a look at the Naval section. Basically the section which covers a lot of ships, normally a lot of them which get passed are massive ships, big cruisers, big battleships, big battle cruisers, and this time is no different. So once again, thank you to the team behind the pasta developers. It's always nice to be able to have a look at the stuff which people are pushing through. The first one is from A Vulgar Potato, and this is talking about the USS Wichita, the CA-45. The Wichita is a very large American machine, and the idea from A Vulgar Potato, this post was made on the 10th of September 2019. It was designed in a way, at least for him, since the upcoming Admiral Hipper class, which was being added to the game at the time, this would be a American counter to that, so therefore it would be similar in characteristics. The Wichita was laid down in 1935 and it was launched in 1937, and it also took part in 3 major operations in World War II. These were Operation Torch, the Second Battle of the Philippines, and also the Battle of Okinawa. It was based off a modified Brooklyn-class hull and is one of the last United States heavy cruisers which was built in accordance with the London Naval Treaty and underwent a ton of retrofittings during its service life. The one, at least, A Vulgar Potato has picked is the 1943 variant. The USS Wichita is larger in size and armament compared to the Fur Attacker, but when you compare it to the Admiral Hipper, it is similar in armament, however boasting a thicker armor belt while being considerably lighter in displacement than it. And if you want to know the general armament of this machine, it had 9 8-inch guns set in 3 separate turrets, which were triple mounts, 8 5-inch guns, the Mark 12s, and then 24 40mm, 4 quads and 4 duals, and then also it had 18 20mm Oerlikons. So just like a lot of other American machines, a ton of AA on this machine, and also with the major 8-inch guns. The belt armor on it was 6.4 inches or 160mm, with 200mm for the turret and 150mm for the conning tower, so that should definitely give it a little bit of armor. The next one is the Deutschland, which is seen as Germany's last cruiser that they built. And this is basically a post-World War II cruiser that West Germany operated. And its story starts, obviously, after the Second World War. The German armed forces were allowed to be reformed in West Germany under the new Bundeswehr. And this meant that the Bundesmarine, which of course was the Federal Navy, sought to construct a new capital ship that could also act as a multi-role support vessel in both peacetime and also wartime roles. The warship would be designed as a Schulschiff or training cruiser, providing naval cadets with a wide variety of machinery aboard to familiarize prospective cadets with all in-service Bundesmarine equipment. And this included originally 2 different diesel engines, 2 Mercedes ones, and also 2 Maybach engines, and also a steam turbine. The emphasis of the machine was on training classrooms, which filled the interior of the ship, with civilian personnel accompanying the naval crew members in different teaching capacities. And given the large nature of the ship, it actually exceeded the imposed naval tonnages set by the Allied powers, and this required a permission from the WEU, which was the Western European Union, in order to construct it, and that was approved. So this future vessel would later become the flagship of the modern Bundesmarine, and technically the only post-war cruiser which was constructed by Germany. The machine itself was laid down on the 11th of September 1959 at the Nobelskrug shipyard in Rendsburg and launched on the 5th of November 1960. It was commissioned on the 26th of May 1966 after an extended period of shipyard delays and assigned to the German Navy Academy at Mervik. and originally the ship was planned to use the name Berlin, but due to the political relations between the two German nations, obviously at the time you had East Germany and West Germany, this was reconsidered and the name was changed to Deutschland to reflect a united Germany. And the service of the ship was considered uneventful, with thousands of naval cadets completing their training aboard the Deutschland for a period of 25 years. It visited 120 foreign ports on all continents and also led 35 training voyages with a grand total of 700,000 nautical miles covered. And after her decommissioning on the 28th of June 1990, there were efforts to try and save the vessel as a museum, given its significance to the Bundesmarine, especially when it came to the training, but unfortunately this was unsuccessful. The Deutschland was sold for scrap in the October of 1993 and was scrapped in India the following year. The guns on this thing are quite impressive though. It had four 100mm 1953 autocannons. It also had four 40mm Breda Bofors, the 106s. It had two dual mounts of them, and then it had two 40mm Breda Bofors 107 autocannons in single mounts. Also had some torpedo tubes, and also the ASWRLs, which is always fun, and also DCRs as well. So this thing was, at least when you compare it to modern weaponry during the time it was built, it favored rate of fire over just overall large caliber guns. I apologize for forgetting to put in the person who put forward the Deutschland. It was Way of the Woke, and the next one is by Kleiner Panzer, and this is for some USSR destroyers, or some Soviet destroyers, the Project 30K and also the Project 30 BIS destroyers, which, you know, are very similar to what we already have in game. Basically, they were post-war upgrades of the Project 30 destroyer, which was also known as the Ognavoy. These ships were intended to be built before and during the war as Project 30s, but production was halted after just one ship was completed. So these things, until after the war, never saw the light of day, and they also never got to the numbers that they were supposed to. So the Project 30 was intended as a destroyer to be the larger counterpart to the Project 7, which would later become the Project 7U, which we have in game. It was based on an enlarged version of the Project 7 hull, and it was a more modern design, featuring dual guns in enclosed turrets, and overall more efficient use of its space. Anti-aircraft armaments compared to the original Project 7 was boosted significantly in the designs, although this would not be the case once the ships were built, and the stability, hull strength, seaworthiness, and cruising range was also improved on the machine. The first hull was laid in 1939. This would eventually become the Ognavoy, and out of 30 additional ships laying in 1939, 40, and 41, 5 would be launched, but only one, which would be the Ognavoy, would be completed in 1945. The other 4, as well as 6 other incomplete hulls, would survive the war to be built into the Project 30K destroyers. The remaining hulls would be scrapped, both by German forces during the war and Soviet forces after the war, and the bow of one Project 30 was also used to repair the Project 7U destroyer, the Starozovoy, in 1943. The single Ognavoy wouldn't see combat before the end of hostilities as well, and therefore, post-war, in 1947, the Project 30K would be approved for construction. The arrangement of the boilers and engines, as well as their compartmentalization, was slightly edited, although remained overall similar to the original design. And the Project 30K also received various new radar devices for fire control, the twin 76
millimeter anti-aircraft gun mount was replaced by a twin 85 millimeter gun mount, and the four Dishka machine guns on the original Project 30 plans were replaced by 3 twin turret DSHKM2 turrets, which are a hell of a lot more deadly. These ships would be completed in the end of the 1940s, but would only see service for a few years, at most a decade in some cases, before being sold, sunk, or scrapped. And while the Project 30K was akin to a second series of Project 30s, the Project 30 BIS was a moderate redesign first drafted in October 1945. This was approved for production also in 1947. Most of its statistics were nearly identical to the 30K. However, the BIS would also be the first Soviet ship with longitudinal framing, greatly increasing both the structural integrity but also the weight of the machine. And compared to the 30K, the BIS had upgraded anti-air capabilities. It retained the same primary armament though, 2 twin 130mm gun turrets, as well as the 92K twin 85mm gun battery. It was instead featured 4 twin 37mm automatic guns on the V11 mounts in place of the 70K turrets, as well as 3 twin 25mm on 2M and 3M mounts. The torpedo tubes were changed from 2 triple torpedo launchers to 2 5 torpedo launchers, and most production variants featured a BMB-2 anti-submarine bomb mortar as well. The 30K and the 30 BIS were born out of a desperate need for new destroyers, as well as the Project 41, which once again would only produce 1 ship, which was still in development, and the Project 56, which was a distant design, which I believe was never produced. By the time they were produced, talking about the 30K and the 30 BIS, they were pretty much obsolete, and despite the many advanced radar and fire control systems aboard, compared to what other nations were creating, this definitely wasn't up to snuff. 8 of the Project 30 BISs would be converted to Project 31 electronic reconnaissance ships, while a number would see service in foreign navies. And just to give you an idea of the way that these machines were at least seen, they were supposed to create around 70 Project 30 destroyers during the war, and as you can see, that obviously didn't happen. Now it's time to have a look at some stuff from the Royal Navy, and this is from It's Lubu, and we're talking about the HMS Revenge, which is a slightly larger ship compared to the other ones that we've talked about so far. The HMS Revenge, which is a wonderful name by the way, was a lead ship of 5 Revenge-class super dreadnought battleships which were built for the Royal Navy during the First World War. With the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships already in various stages of completion, it was decided to construct a new class of battleship. However, what specification this was to be was somewhat up in the air. Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt, the new director of the DNC, was tasked with the design of fresh battleships for the 1939 program, and eventually it was settled that this new class was to have 15-inch guns and armor strakes similar to those of the QE class. The most obvious difference between these two classes was that the later ships had 1 funnel and were slightly smaller. Being smaller and with a more narrow beam, saving space was important, and this was found through the propulsion system, with 18 boilers giving a top speed of around 21 knots. The 1913 program called for the construction of 8 ships of this class. However, with the outbreak of the First World War and only 5 being laid down, the rest were cancelled. The Royal Sovereign class, as they sometimes referred to, were to be a powerful presence, but the records show that from the very start, these ships never enjoyed a good reputation as either the QE or even the Iron Duke class at the time. The naval scrapping schemes during the interwar period saw many of the Royal Naval capital ships broken up for scrap, with many of the older dreadnoughts meeting their fate. If not for the fact that the Revenge class carried 15-inch guns, they may also have met a similar fate, given their slower speed, and also because of their slower speed, it was becoming more apparent that faster battleships would, be able to outclass it, which were entering service. Whilst they would be modernized, they did in fact represent a different era, and their value, built at the time for a costing of around £2.5 million, was now becoming increasingly limited. By the outbreak of the Second World War, they have each been relegated to secondary duties, and as such would have been unlikely to encounter some of the newer Axis designs. The R-Class never underwent the extensive refits that had been installed upon the earlier QE class, which would have maintained their status as a frontline ship. Whilst they were refitted during the 1920s, their relative speed meant they would struggle to keep up, and this was a problem that was never corrected during their 30-year service. The HMS Revenge was laid down at the Vickers shipyard in Barrow-in-Furness in the 22nd of December 1913. It was commissioned into the Grand Fleet on the 1st of February 1916, given pennant number 06, and was present at the Battle of Jutland in May 1916, barely 3 months after its commission. During the action, she engaged Koenig, narrowly avoided 4 separate torpedoes from German destroyers, missed an opportunity to finish off the severely damaged Sigdilts, engaged the Zeppelin L-11, and after the torpedoing of the Marlborough, assumed the role of flagship 1st Battle Squadron. Revenge fired 102 rounds of 15-inch and 1 torpedo during the battle. She was flagship of the 2nd in command Grand Fleet from November 1916. After the war, she served in the Atlantic Fleet from April 1919, frequently in the role of flagship of her squadron, 2nd in command of the fleet, and as fleet flagship in November 1924 to October 1927. From January to July 1920, she was detached to the Mediterranean with the 1st Battle Squadron because of the crisis in Turkey and saw service in the Black Sea. She had a 2nd detachment to Turkey waters from September 1922 to March of 23, and then in January of 1925 she sank the battleship Monarch, which was stricken according to the Washington Treaty agreements after the old ship had been used as a gunnery target. On her relief as fleet flagship by Nelson in October 1927, she reverted to a private ship and paid off on the 11th of January 1928 for a major refit at Plymouth. This was completed at the end of 1928, the ship recommissioning on the 2nd of January 1929 for the Mediterranean Fleet, where she remained until paying off at Portsmouth for a refit on the 6th of February 1936. This was completed in March 1937, and Revenge recommissioned on the 1st of June for the 1st Battle Squadron Home Fleet. You can see that it definitely had an interesting story leading up to the Second World War. And in the Second World War as well, it also had a lot going on. So at the outbreak of the war in 1939, she was assigned to the Channel Force, based at Portland, until the activities of German raiders caused her to be ordered to South Atlantic Command on the 1st of October 1939. This was immediately cancelled, however, and she was ordered to join the 3rd Battle Squadron, North Atlantic Escort Force at Halifax in NS, in Nova Scotia, basically eastern Canada, and screened convoys across the Atlantic until August 1940, when she was transferred to Plymouth Command in view of the threat of invasion. In the course of this deployment, she bombarded Cherbourg with 120 rounds of 15-inch from a range of 9 miles on 11th of October. The following month, she returned to the North Atlantic, taking part in the hunt for the Bismarck, but in August 1941, she was selected for transfer to the Eastern Fleet. Her activities in this theatre were limited to convoy escort duties in the Indian Ocean, and in September 1943, she returned to Britain and was reduced to reserve for subsidiary service. She remained in this category for the rest of the war, apart from a trip to Malta in November 1943 with Churchill in connection with his conference in Tehran.
On her return, she joined the Portsmouth Command in January 44. Her 15-inch guns were removed in May for use as spare guns for the Normandy Bombardment Force, and on the 17th of December 1944, she was attached to the training establishment in Piraeus until placed on the disposal list on the 8th of March 1948. In July, the ship was handed over to Biscoe for scrapping and allocated to T.W. Ward & Co. for breaking up, arriving at Inverkeithing on the 5th of September 1948. So as you can see, one hell of a machine. And at the end of the day, it also had a ton of armor, and also it had a ton of weaponry on it as well. Basically, at its height, it had 8 15-inch guns, which obviously is very impressive. It also had a secondary battery of 12 45 caliber BL 6-inch guns, the 152mm, and then the anti-air battery. It had 8 AA guns in twin shields, or 8-inch AA guns in twin shields, 16 2-pounder guns, then also 8 50 cals and 4 torpedo tubes as well, triple mounted, and then 4 21-inch torpedo tubes later in 2 sets. So it basically had an absolute metric ton of guns on it, the main ones being in dual mounts, and also would be the 381mm, which would be kind of insane. It also had a massive amount of armor on it, 13 inches of belt armor, and also when it comes to the turrets, 13 inches as well. Definitely a tough cookie to crack when it would come to this compared to other machines. The next one is from Azens, and it's talking about the Matsu class destroyer, or the Type Te destroyer, and this actually has a really interesting story behind it. So it all starts in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and basically Japanese destroyers were used for mouse transports, also known as the Tokyo Express, and basically the idea of this transport mission was you needed to approach and land munitions at night and be able to escape from enemy aircraft, the radius that they would be able to engage them on before dawn. So basically, night supply runs for these machines. These operations, unfortunately, the Japanese lost a lot of destroyers, and the destroyers that they were building to replace them couldn't compensate, the Type Co destroyers at the time. So fleet destroyers like the Type Co didn't really fit these operations as well, so they needed to build some form of simplified destroyer that would fit for landing operations and also transporting supplies. So in November 1942, they designed what is known as the F-55. That began, and they completed 9 plans. And the last of the plans that was adopted was Plan H, which had a main turbine of the Otori-class torpedo boat, and they planned to build 42 of these between 1943 and 45, and basically there was a budget approved for 32 of them to be built, and but then in 1944, after that approved budget in 1943, they approved budget to build 10 of them, and the Matsuru Naval Arsenal planned to build 5, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal planned to build 24, and also the Fuji Nagata shipyards were planning to build 13. The first vessel, which was known as the Matsu, which means pine, was laid down in August 8th, 1943. It was launched on the 3rd of February and completed on the 28th of April 1944. The construction period of this ship was only about 9 months, and spent only about 85,000 man-hours on it. The average construction period of a Matsu class was about 6 months, and eventually the Matsu class was eventually known as the Tachibana class destroyer. And basically what these destroyers were used for was flagships for escort convoys. They belonged to the 31st Squadron, which was the anti-submarine mobile unit that consisted of old destroyers, coastal defense ships, and also the Matsu class. And in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which would
was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 4 Matsu classes, the Kuwa, Maki, Kiri, and Sugi, joined on the first mobile fleet. And after the decisive battle, they still sent reinforcements of the Ormoc, or onto the Ormoc, I should say, the island. And these operations were called Tar-Go, but lots of the group was lost during the raid. And in 1945, some of the vessels were modified for Caton carriers for maritime special attack forces, and the mission of this force was to attack enemy landing force on the Battle of mainland Japan, and also some vessels were used for floating AA forts, so basically to be able to annihilate anything coming in. And one of the most curious battles of the Matsu class was the 7th Tar-Go operation. Basically, on the night of the 2nd of December, the convoy started to land at Ormoc Bay, and there were 3 Sumner-class destroyers there. There was the USS Allen M. Sumner, the USS Moal, and the USS Cooper, which actually intercepted them. So Gecko and also Zuin bombed them, but only got a little bit of damage on them, and the Japanese convoy consisted only of 2 Matsu-class destroyers, the Kuwa and the Take, or the Tak, a transporter number 9, transporter number 140, and 159. So the USS Cooper started shelling at a range of 11,000 meters. The Japanese side misunderstood that they thought it was a light cruiser that was coming after them, but instead it was 2 destroyers which were attacking them. The Kuwa was sunk in 9 minutes, but the Take actually did pretty well. It was cruising at 24 knots in the bay, launched 2 torpedoes, and one of the torpedoes hit the USS Cooper, and it sunk within a minute. And also the USS Mole hit its main gun on the front engine room. And by this damage, the hull of the Take was lent at about 30 degrees, and one shaft had also stopped. But the US forces at the time thought that the torpedo attack had come from a submarine, so they actually pulled out, which meant that the convoy was able to return to Manila. And this was seen as the last achievement of a Japanese destroyer sinking an enemy ship with a torpedo, which I think is actually pretty cool. Now, talking about its weaponry, obviously these things were designed not entirely to deal with other destroyers, but mainly AA was very much involved. So they had 3 127mm AA guns, and then also 20 to 25 25mm machine guns. So a ton of AA fire would be able to be created. Basically 4 triple mounts and 8 to 13 single mounts, with the 3 127mm in a single mount and a twin mount. They also had a torpedo launcher of a quadruple torpedo tube that it could use. It also could carry some depth charges as well. So therefore, it didn't have a ton of main caliber weaponry when it comes to the game, basically only 3 major guns, but could perform as a pretty interesting AA machine as well, and would definitely fit in the 3740 area, at least in my opinion. The last one is an Italian battleship put forward by Zero, and this is the Giulio Cesare, or as we know it's the Giulio Caesar, so I'm going to just call it the Giulio Caesar. And basically, what this thing is another massive battleship, which I'm sure will eventually come to the game, especially since Italy right now misses some of its dreadnoughts, some of its battle cruisers, and all of that wonderful stuff. Basically, when it starts, or the life of this thing starts, before the First World War. It was laid down in 1910 and completed in 1914 as one of the 3 ships of its class. It was alongside the Conte di Cavour and the Leonardo da Vinci, which the Leonardo da Vinci was actually irreparably damaged by a magazine explosion in 1916. And the vessel didn't see any combat in World War I, largely on account of the Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine's capital ship sitting in the port after 1915 and refusing to set sail again until the war was almost over. Its first and for a while only operational deployment was actually during the Corfu incident, a diplomatic crisis caused by the murder of an Italian general sent to mediate a border dispute between Greece and Albania in Greek territory. Following this and Italy's entry into World War II, other than a brief deployment to support the invasion of Albania in 1939, the vessel would be shifted to the reserves and would receive a number of upgrades over subsequent years. Between the aforementioned incident and World War II, Giulio Cesare received a number of modifications and modernizations, most notably a major overhaul between 33 and 37, which saw the ship's dimensions in length, beam, and also draft increased, the removing of 2 propeller shafts and replacement of the engines and boilers, which yielded an improved top speed of 27 knots under operational conditions, the boring out of also the main battery to 320mm, the removal of the central triple gun turret and torpedo tubes, and a significant increase to the anti-aircraft armament with numerous 37mm and 13.2mm weapons installed on the ship as well. The AA armament would be increased a couple of times during the war, mostly by replacing the 13.2mm machine guns with 20mm cannons. Giulio Caesar's first proper wartime deployment against enemy naval units took place at the Battle of Calabria, the largest fleet action in the Mediterranean during the war, alongside its sister ship, the Conte de Cavour, against elements of the British Mediterranean fleet, during which Giulio Caesar was hit by the battleship the HMS Warspite in what was at the time the longest range gun hit by a warship against another warship in history, causing moderate damage and forcing the Italian vessel to disengage, with repairs being completed a month later. Giulio Caesar would become one of a number of Italian warships caught in the Taranto harbor by the Fairy Swordfish torpedo bombers of the Fleet Air Arm, and this time the fortunes of the 2 Conte de Cavours was reversed, with Conte de Cavour itself struck by a torpedo and deliberately run aground to shallow water to prevent the loss of the ship, which attempts to return the vessel to operational status were never completed, unfortunately, and the ship was scrapped in 1946, while Giulio Caesar didn't sustain any hits at all. Over the next couple of years, Giulio Caesar would see further deployments, but didn't really accomplish much before being relegated once again to training duties at the start of 1942. And following the Italian surrender, Giulio Caesar put down a mutiny in Taranto and fended off sporadic German air attacks, then proceeded to Malta to be interned until the middle of 1944, when he returned to Taranto. Following the war, however, Giulio Caesar was handed over to the Soviet Union as war reparations, though not without the Italians attempting to sabotage the vessel prior to the transfer in December 1948. The following year, Giulio Caesar was struck from the Naval Register and officially handed over. The Soviets then commissioned the ship as the Novorossiysk, and once again the ship served mostly as a training vessel. Over the next 6 years, the former Giulio Caesar was refitted no less than 8 times by any but any further attempts to modernize the ship were cut short, as on the night of the 28th to 29th of October 1955, a massive explosion ripped open the hull, causing the ship to capsize, taking 608 men with it. To this day, it's not exactly known what caused the explosion, but the most credible theory was that the ship hit a submerged mine left in Sevastopol from the war with its anchor chain. Though some claim that the Italians got the last laugh over having to give up their battleship via a Frogram raid. I mean, you never know, would you? So basically, the main armaments that you find on this machine is 2 triple and 2 twin-mounted 320mm guns. It also had 6 twin 120mm on it, 4 twin 100s, 6 twin 37s, and also 6 twin 13.2mm AA guns. So You can see that this thing has massive armaments that it could easily have in, with its deck being 135 to 106 millimeters of armor, and also the barbettes being 130 to 280 millimeters of armor as well. The main issue with this thing is only being able to go 27 knots, but generally, for the ship of this size, I think that would generally be seen as fine, since of course its main caliber armament of 8 is it? Oh no, 10 320mm guns would be incredibly devastating on anybody which came across it. Anyway, that is all of the naval suggestions for December 2020. I'd like to thank you for watching this, and I'll see you next time.
I'd just like to thank Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hosest Kishot, Hans, Barine, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.